HTTP interfaces to interact with our data. Not bad, not bad. I think we clearly covered our two options. So one is sending back the JSON data, and the second one is server-side rendering. So why don't we start by covering the most basic JSON response? And here's what I'm trying to mimic. If you go to Course API, and then if you look for the Tours project, you'll hit the URL, of course, and here you can see that we're getting back a JSON data. It is an array, and each object represents a tour. And if you took my React course, you know that we were practicing data fetching in React, and effectively we hit this URL, and we got the data, we got our JSON data back, and then we built an app using that data. But again, the whole point here is following, where it doesn't have to be React. It can be vanilla JavaScript application. It can be Svelte framework. It can be any setup where you're able to fetch that data. So in here on the server, we just share the JSON. So in this case, of course, that is Tours. And then anywhere, anyone who wants to access this data, they can just access it and build something using that data. And that's why it is so powerful. And essentially, this is what we're going to do. We're just going to send back first a most basic array, and then we'll see how we can make this more dynamic. Please keep in mind two things. First, of course, eventually we will use database for that. And of course, I will mention that probably 20,000 times as we're building these examples. And the second thing that I would like you to understand, that when it comes to Express basics, so essentially how we set up the server, it doesn't really matter whether we're using server side or whether we're using JSON. Again, if we understand the principles, we'll have no problem using any of those options. So first, what I would want is to navigate back to my project. And again, this is going to be the time where I do write everything from scratch, but then starting with next example, I'll just use some options that we already covered. So for now, yes, I'll remove everything. And again, we'll set up Express one last time. So we're going to go with Express, require, and Express. Okay, awesome. Then const app is equal to require, or I'm sorry, not require. We need to invoke the Express like so. And then let's go with app.listen, port 5000. And then let's call our callback function. And then let's go again with console log, and server is listening on port, and of course the port number is 5000. Then again, I would want to set up app.get, because that is the HTTP method that all browsers perform by default. So I'm going to go with app.get. And I'm not going to go with specific path. Just keep in mind that you can. And of course, we'll do that later. For example, I can go here with API, and then, I don't know, I can call this product or whatever. For the time being, let's just make it simple. And we'll just handle all the root requests. So that way we can save a little bit of typing in the browser. And again, we have our function, our callback function, rec and res. And as far as the response, we're going to go with res. And then the method name is JSON. Now, we will go to the docs just so you understand where I'm getting this information from. But before we do that, let me just tell you that I might omit here and there the status one just so we can save a little bit of typing. But don't worry, once we go to some more serious examples, of course, we'll still use the statuses, because in my opinion, that is just a better approach where we actually have control over the status. And as far as the documentation, if we go back to Express documentation, we're looking for API reference. Again, we are using 4 point something. So we are using version 4. So make sure you look for the same one. And don't confuse with Express JSON. So this is going to be a middleware that we pass in. Effectively, we're looking for response in the docs. And then we're looking for this JSON option. So res object has the JSON method. And what happens, we send back the JSON response. And this method sends a response with correct content type that is a parameter converted to a JSON string using JSON stringify. This parameter can be any JSON type, including object, array, string, and blah, blah, blah. So hopefully you get the gist. So the only thing we need to do is go back. And for example, I'll provide an array where there's going to be two objects. And first one will be name John. And the second one will be Susan. So another object. And we'll say name is equal to Susan. And we have our most basic API. So if I go back to my localhost 5000 and refresh, there it is. So now anywhere in the world, I can access this data and build something using this data. Now there's tiny caveat. When I say anywhere in the world, there's still going to be at the moment a course error. And I'll cover that once we actually cover middleware. So again, please be patient. We will get there, but hopefully you get the gist where this serves our data. And now we can just access that data and build the front-end app using this data. Now, this default setup is nice, but of course we can do something more meaningful. Where if you take a look at the folder, you'll notice this data.js. Now, what is data.js? It is simply a file with some arrays. And the first array is going to be products. And here, as you can see, I have objects. And then each of these objects represents a single product. And all the way in the bottom, we're exporting both arrays. We're exporting products as well as the people array that we're going to cover a bit later. So now what I would want to do is import products array in my app.js. And then instead of hard coding this value like so, where I just pass in the array with two objects, I'll just dump the whole products data. So let's go with const. We already know how to do that. Now, since I'm exporting multiple things, since I'm exporting an object, I will be explicit of what I would want. So I'm going to go with product. And basically, I'm destructuring right away. I'm going to say product is equal to require. And remember, the file is data.js, like so. And then instead of passing array directly, I can simply go with product. And what do you know? When you navigate to the root, there it is. Now we have more meaningful JSON response, where actually this is a products data. So on my front end, I can grab it and I can build some kind of nice front end using this data. Now, lastly, before we go, let me just showcase that, of course, there's going to be a content type set up correctly as well. So if you go to network tab, and again, if you refresh localhost like so, and take a look. Now, of course, what is the content type? That is application JSON. So now, of course, we're correctly getting our JSON data. So hopefully you have a clear understanding how to send JSON data. So now, of course, let's make things a bit more interesting and cover some more advanced Express topics. Nice. Once we're familiar with the most basic JSON setup, now let's build a more meaningful API. And in a process, we'll cover route parameters as well as query string parameters. And I would want to start in the following way, where essentially I'll leave all of this code. But when it comes to my route, when it comes to my homepage, I'll essentially send back the heading 1 with the link as well. And that link will direct a user to a /API and then product. And then later we'll cover the params as well as the query string. So let's start with sending back HTML instead. So I'm not going with JSON one, and I'm not going to send back the file. I'll go directly and I'll say send. And in here we have the string, of course. So I'm going to go with heading 1 and then home page. Then I'll make sure that I close, because I believe in one of the previous videos, I believe it was the Express Basics. I think I messed it up here. Notice I didn't add the closing one. So now everything is correct. And now I'm going to go with my link. Then as far as the href, I'm going to direct a user to API. and then / product. And then, of course, I'll also set up a text here. So product, and I'll close my link. So that should do it. That is my homepage. And now, of course, if I go to localhost 5000, there it is. I have my homepage. And once I click the link, I navigate to API products. Now, of course, the moment I have the default response from the express, meaning the default 404 response, where the resource cannot be found. And as a side note, if you want to take a look, what response do they send? Again, go to the network. This is going to be very, very useful. Tab, refresh, and take a look at their response. So notice the response. That's the HTML that they send back. So cannot get, and then API products. Now we already know why there is this get, the HTTP verb, because that's the method that the browser performs. Okay, awesome. So now, of course, our job is to set up a GET request for this resource. So we go with app.get, and I specifically want to handle API and product. So this one just looks a little bit more realistic. So in here, I go with API and product, and keep in mind, of course, those values need to match. Otherwise, you'll get that 404. Again, I have my callback function. And now, of course, I would want to send back the product. However, in this case, we'll make it a little bit different. Where previously, notice the product, we send back pretty much the whole thing, right? But a more realistic approach is following, where when you're requesting a bunch of data, so when you're requesting collection of the data, you're not always returning everything for that one specific product. And to give you a real world example, again, I'm going to go back to my React projects, and I'm simply using them because this gives you a visual representation. During the course, we built a e-commerce, and then in the products page, notice how we're fetching the products. But you need to keep in mind one thing, where we're only fetching about the product, the title, the price, the image, and I believe also the ID. And only when I go to that single product page, this is where I get the rest of the data. Whether that is, for example, a stars, the reviews, the description, the availability, and all that stuff. So what I'm trying to say is when you're requesting a collection of data, there's going to be cases where I simply want to send back some minimal response. So for example, again, that could be name, image, and the price in this scenario. And only if I look for this specific product, then I send back everything. And in order to mimic that, in our example, in this response, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to iterate over my product. I'll use the map method, and I'll just remove my description. So when I'm sending back the product, it's going to be without a description. So again, if we were to send back everything, I would simply go with response JSON, and then I pass in the product. So again, if we go here and if you refresh, now everything is cool. I'm getting my product on the API product route. However, I'm going to make it a bit more realistic, and we're going to go with const new product is equal to product.map. So I'm mapping over, and I'm creating a new array, and I'll reference each item as a product. And then as far as the return, well, first I would want to destructure the properties out of the product. And the reason why I can access them is because those are the names that I used when I was setting it up. So ID, name, image, and all of that. And that is equal to the product. Again, I'm just using simple JavaScript structuring. And then as far as the return, whatever I'm going to return from my function, well, that is going to be the new value. So now I'm going to go with ID, name, as well as the image. And once I have this setup in place, instead of returning products, now, of course, I'm going to go with new products. And if I go back to my browser, there it is. So now I'm getting a collection, but I'm not sending everything that I know about this specific item. So I'm being selective of what I'm sending back. So yes, there's a resource by the name of API product, and we're sending back the array, but we know that if the user wants to access that description, he or she will have to look for a specific product. And in the process, we'll cover what are the URL parameters. All right, so we're successfully sharing a list of items. So now, of course, let's take a look at how we can provide info about that one specific product. So, for example, if I navigate to product and then / and one, and then I'm going to get only the info about this first product because it has the ID of one. And not only I'll get these three properties, but I'll also get the description. And our initial approach would go something like this, where yes, I see the product. Okay, beautiful. And we already know how to set up the route. Now, since I'll delete it eventually anyway, I'm just going to copy and paste so we can speed this up. So I'm going to go with API products and then / one. That just means that I'm going to be looking for item number one in here. And then instead of map, we'll use the find method. So I'm importing all my products. And in order to get the single product, I'm going to write the following code where we're going to go with const single product. And don't worry, we will reuse this code. So it's not like we're just randomly typing something. So let's go with products and then find. Now, again, I'll reference each product with a parameter of product in my callback function. And then if the product ID matches one, because that is my route here, then of course I'll return that single product. So I'm going to say single product. And technically this works. So notice now, of course, I have only info about this one specific product and I have the description. However, it feels like using bazooka on a cockroach. Yeah, it gets the job done, but probably is an overkill. Because keep in mind, at the moment we have only 4 products. So yes, if I really wanted to, I could set up 4 routes. But what if I have 100, 200, 300? Well, that's not going to work. And in Express, we have something called route parameters, which essentially is going to be way better solution. So instead of hard coding this 1, 2, 3, or whatever ID would want, we set up a route parameter. And it's going to look something like this, where I go with my route, and then I have / and then I go with colon, and then whatever name I would want. So think of this as a placeholder. So you can call this Bobby Lee, you can call this chicken burrito. In my case, I'm going to go with product and the ID, just to be explicit of what I'm expecting over here. But again, naming here is really up to you. And what is more important is the fact how we can access it. Now, if you want, you can actually console log the request object. Again, this is just going to be a giant object. And for now, I'm just going to leave this one the way it is. So I'm still going to be returning a product number 1. And also let's look for request. And then we're looking for the params property. So let me console log this one. And then again, once I navigate back, and if I refresh in the API products number 1, what you'll notice, again, this giant request object where we have a bunch of useful properties and methods. And of course, I'm not going to cover all of them right now, but similar to HTTP, of course, in the Express, we also have access to a bunch of useful things in that request object. And one of them is the params. So check it out. Now I have this product ID and the value is 1. Now, please keep in mind one thing, that whatever you're going to be setting up here in the URL as that route parameter is always going to come back as a string. And this is important in this case, because if you take a look at our data, the ID is a number. And of course, we'll deal with that in a second. And whatever we set up as far as our name is going to be right in here. Is going to be in this request and then parameters object. So now, of course, what I could do is I could just destructure it from the params and then use it in order to find that specific product. So that way I don't have to hard code products number one, products number two, and on and on and on. Instead, I just set up my route parameter and just come up with whatever name I would want. Just make sure that you add this colon here, and then we'll access that value and get a specific product. So I'll leave these two suckers for your reference, just in case you would ever want to console log them. And we'll simply go with const, and the name is product ID, and that is equal to request. That's my request object and params. Then I'm going to use this product ID to get my product. But remember, it is a string. We can clearly see that. And in fact, here in the array, well, the IDs are numbers. So if we'll just try to search it the way it is, of course, we won't be able to get our product. So instead, what we want is pass in the number and then product ID. Now, of course, if your IDs are set up as strings, which is somewhat typical setup for the databases and all that, as well as the headless CMSs, then of course you don't need to worry about it. Then you can just pass in the string. And now, of course, I'm going to be able to get my one product. So now, if I go back and if I refresh, everything still works. And if I go to my URL and start changing these values, hopefully you can see that now, of course, I'm getting a different product. Now I'm getting product number 2. Then I go to product number 3, and on and on and on. So now with these few simple lines of code, I can access any product in my array. Now, of course, there's also a case where we cannot find the product, because keep in mind here, I can type whatever I would want. So I can go with products, and then let's imagine that the user types ABC. Now, do we have a product with an ID of ABC? Of course, the answer is no. So what's happening over here? Now I don't get anything back, right? Well, I don't get anything back because if I go to log and then single product, let's see what we're going to get back again. Let me refresh ABC, and this one is undefined. So that's what we're sending back as a single product. So what would be a solution? Well, a solution is setting up a if statement here, where I say, get me the single product. If you cannot find that single product, if basically that product doesn't exist, if the ID that the user passed in does not make sense, you cannot find the product with that ID, then return 404. So how is that going to look like? Well, we can go here if and then single product. So we set up a if condition, and of course I'm going to go with if single product doesn't exist. So I'm going to add exclamation point, and of course this is going to be our case with undefined. This will be true if it is undefined, and then we just go with a return res, and in this case I will add a status because that is extremely important that I go with 404, and then we go with send, and product does not exist, like so. Now, if everything is correct, then of course we go with res and JSON. So in here I say return and res.json. So once I go right now to product and then ABC, there it is. Now, of course, I have proper 404. Product does not exist. And if again take a look at the tab, and I have my ABC. Now, if I'm going to navigate to a route where I can find the product, then of course I'm going to get my proper product response. So whenever you think of route parameters, think of them as placeholders where user provides a data, and then using request and params, we can access that data and then set up some kind of logic. And before we continue and cover query string parameters, let me just mention that route parameters can get way more complex than this. So for example, imagine this scenario. I can go with app.get. Again, I need to come up with some kind of route. So I'm going to go with API, then products. So I'm looking for specific product. So I'm going to use a route parameter. Let's call this product ID. Then I'm going to look for all the reviews, and then maybe there's a review ID. So review, and then ID. And now, of course, again, I have rec and res, like so. And then I'm simply going to send back some kind of dummy data, but I would want to console log the rec params, just so you understand how everything works. And now let me send res.send. So res.send, and I'm just going to say simple hello world. Let's save this one. And again, in the browser, let's go here. We have products. Again, some kind of ID, whether that's ABC, whether that is a number. In this case, it doesn't really matter since you can see that there's not much functionality in there, but we need to type in here reviews. And then, for example, the review ID would be, I don't know, ABC. So once I navigate here, of course, I'm going to get my hello world. And then in the console, notice how I'm accessing all of them. So I have the product ID as well as the review ID. So again, they can get way more complex than just this simple approach. And one more thing I would like to mention, this reviews though is hard coded. So if I go back, I can change the ABC and for however I would like. But if I'll change from reviews to review, I'm going to get a 404. Why? Well, because a review is not a route parameter. So that's not a placeholder. So if this is incorrect, then of course I get the 404. Hopefully that is clear. And now let's talk about